Hello everybody and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for nearly 12 years now actually, looking back, and I sit within the knowledge and practice area of the organisation, looking at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with our members working right across the property life cycle through land, planning and development, construction, building operation, finance, valuation, end of life, and indeed across a whole host of different asset types in terms of all the forms of residential accommodation, commercial infrastructure, alternative assets, and indeed land use itself. It's an incredibly broad canvas upon which data and technology can help the profession and indeed those who rely on the profession when they're looking at using land and property. And today I'm really pleased to have Martin join me from Alertacall. So Martin, do join me on the call.
Hi.
Welcome, Martin. Now, before we get into kind of the tech side of things, it'd be great to hear a bit of a short sort of backstory from your perspective, and indeed a bit of the origin story about Alertacall.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure there's a lot of people that have not come across this before. Alertacall's actually been around since 2005, and when it was originally set up, it was actually to try and meet the needs of the founder's grandmother, and she at the time was in her mid-80s. She'd been married for 50 years, but her husband had died a few years previously. She was living in a family home on her own. And of course, she got to that age where she wasn't as mobile as she used to be. And as lots of people will know, if you've got kind of like parents or grandparents in that position, kind of like the go-to product or service for somebody like that is for them to have a pendant alarm of some description. But she said, stuff off, I'm not going to wear a pendant alarm, which is a pretty common reaction, to be fair.
Yeah.
And in fact, you get some people who kind of like refuse point blank to have one. You get other people who get cajoled or persuaded to have one, but invariably, if you ever go around, it's actually in a fruit bowl or hanging on the back of a door or something. In other words, they're not wearing it. So as a kind of like a solution, it was imperfect. And our founder, James, came up with another idea, which was completely the opposite to an alarm-based service. With an alarm-based service, you've got something that is only going to produce an action if it's activated. You know, if it doesn't go off, we just assume everything's okay, whether it be a house alarm, personal alarm, or whatever. What he created was the OK button, where the individual presses an OK button on a daily basis just to confirm that everything is okay with them. And actually, that works 365 days a year, and if it's not pressed, then you spring into action to just make sure that everything is okay. So that was the embryo of the service. It actually started out as a kind of like a direct-to-consumer proposition as an alternative to pendant alarms. But once you get to the position of having contact with somebody on a daily basis, it actually becomes really useful for all sorts of other circumstances. And in particular, it's very useful for housing management, particularly if you've got higher needs people whose patterns of engagement may change over time. That ability to communicate with somebody's always there because you're in contact with somebody 365 days a year. So actually, since then, the organisation's kind of like morphed, and it still has hundreds and hundreds of individual personal users, but the vast majority of what we do is actually now associated with housing.
Indeed. Now, so that was almost what I was going to ask you around that sense that it's moved from that kind of direct to consumer to use the jargon, a B2B business, when you're actually looking at people who are managing, as you say, numbers of people in various different kinds of facilities.
Absolutely. So, if anybody had been on our website, you'll see that we provide services for housing, health, social care, domiciliary care, that kind of thing. It helps with things like hospital discharge, but ultimately, over 90% of what we do now is for social housing providers, whether that be local authorities with their own housing stock, housing associations, alms houses, other charitable organisations. It's really to help the staff involved in managing the properties where you've got a higher needs occupant of some description.
Indeed. Now, I in terms of kudos to your organisation, I see you won the Queen's Award for Enterprise in 2022. What on what basis? I mean, what kind of parts of your success led to that, do you think?
Yeah, I think that award is actually a really tough award to get. There's lots of awards to win, but this one is properly externally audited by third parties to make sure that all the claims that you make are legitimate and that kind of thing. We won it actually, Queen's Award for Enterprise, and by the way, it therefore appears we're going to be one of the last ever winners of the Queen's Award for Enterprise.
Oh, yes.
But we won it for innovation, and it is to do with how innovative our services are in social housing. But I think it's also because we really care about the customers and the outcomes that are delivered through our services. You know, we recruit our team based on kind of like their ability to kind of like almost empathize and relate to the customer base that we're talking to. We really want it to work. I think a lot of services and a lot of technology and a lot of things that get developed can sometimes be for really the housing provider stroke landlord, and the resident, the tenant, is a very, very secondary consideration. And actually to us, it isn't. It's kind of like, it's at least equal, if not more so. And we do end up with over 90% customer satisfaction ratings. You know, the people in receipt of our services really like what we do. We have, you know, we have testimonials from virtually everybody that we have worked with. So I think it's partly to do with how innovative it is, but I think it's also to do with just how much we care as well.
So, I mean, thinking about you know, the audience that we're talking to today, the RICS members and member firms, what particularly would you highlight that the kind of things you've developed and innovated, as you say, will really be of interest to them given the context they work in?
Yeah, so I think one of the areas which is very high profile at the moment across social housing is ward and call systems. So ward and call systems, a technology that was developed for supported and sheltered housing in the 60s, I think it was. I mean, it was literally born in a time when housing providers were looking for a solution for people that didn't have landline telephones, because most people, whether it be a lower demographic group or whether it be older people, they literally didn't have telephones. It's that old as technology. And I think what's resulted is a solution that would certainly serve its purpose at the time, but also produce properties that look a bit institutionalized. You know, they've got lots of kit bolted to walls and that kind of thing. And actually, it's not, they don't potentially look particularly attractive, but people don't want something looking like that anymore. And ultimately, whether it be an intercom unit or even a video unit, do you really want to go talk to a wall? You know, you'd want to do something differently. And, you know, you take something like the telephone. So in the 1970s, if we wanted to make or receive a telephone call, we had to go to the hallway to do it. You know, everybody, if you were posh, you had a little telephone table, but most people sat on the steps while they were kind of like making a phone call. Well, really, you know, today, in sheltered and supported housing, why should somebody need to go talk to the wall? You know, can we not replicate what was happening in the 1970s and produce something that's kind of like more fit for purpose today? And I think there's a whole host of kind of like design options that are far better than kind of like the traditional systems that are out there.
Now, I'm thinking of a particular event that's coming up that I know I think we can touch on in a number of contexts. This telecoms digital switchover. Tell us a bit about that, and particularly about the impact for social housing providers.
Yes, so I'm sure some people have heard of digital switchover, but for those that haven't, if you cast your mind back about 15 years and we all had huge televisions and the analog signal was being switched off and we were all getting a digital signal before we actually had digital televisions, then we all had to have these little set-top box converters, right? So that was when the television signal went from analog to digital. Basically, the same thing is happening in the telecoms world. So telephones are going from analog to digital. Actually, if you're thinking about your own landline at home, for anybody who still uses one, it's not that big a deal. You know, you might need a different broadband router, you might need a little different adapter when it comes in, but that's pretty much as far as it goes. However, for these kind of like hardwired ward and call systems that are in supported housing, it's a big deal. because those are all analog systems. They run the pull cords that are typically in bathrooms. They run the dispersal arms where there's a base unit and they're connected to the pendant alarm that I spoke about at the beginning. They also are connected to the smoke detectors that are in the individual flats and apartments. And if it is a flat and it's a communal entrance, they'll probably run the door entry system as well. So actually, all of those things, when digital switchover happens, potentially are not going to work. Now, I think some people might have remembered that digital switchover all has to be done by 2025. Actually, earlier this calendar year, BT announced that that was not going to be the deadline. It's going to be put back. To what date has not yet been agreed. I think while all of these hardwired systems will clearly need upgrading or replacing by the time digital switchover deadline is eventually announced, a lot of the systems are very old anyway. They are decades old. Their reliability is declining, and therefore I know a lot of social housing providers are looking to get on with it anyway, because they need, they need to invest in those systems, even if they don't know when digital switchover will happen.
So what sort of retrofit options have they got, given that they're going to have to, as you say, either by the deadline or just because of natural obsolescence and wear and tear and just simply wanting to upgrade? What are these options they have now?
So I think there's largely two options. The traditional providers will still be suggesting that there should be a hardwired system, but it'll probably need upgraded wiring. It'll certainly need upgraded devices, but ultimately, the technology is kind of replicating the current model, whereby you would have wiring that is going to go into every single apartment and flat. The other alternative to that is not use the wiring that goes into every single flat apartment and all those panels that are on the walls. Actually, what you could do is you could just deploy Wi-Fi. But if you deploy Wi-Fi, the beauty of that is that it's a cheaper solution for a start, because you're not doing as much wiring and installation work. It is less disruptive, so you're not kind of like, putting things on people's walls and needing access to individual flats and apartments. But the other thing about Wi-Fi is it then allows you to have devices that are portable, and then ultimately you can also use it for other purposes that are not to do with kind of like ward and call systems. You can use that for CCTV, for example.
I mean, given obviously that Wi-Fi can have some challenges, particularly depending on the property and locational factors and neighbouring and interference. How do you see the kind of management of what is obviously quite a critical service by using Wi-Fi? What are the kind of the pros and cons and the ways of dealing with some of these potentially sort of fragile issues with Wi-Fi sometimes?
Yeah, now that's a really, really good point. And I think there's an element of kind of like misinformation or misunderstanding here, because I think people's frame of reference is often their experience at home. With everybody working from home during the pandemic, and people have kind of like, they've frozen or the sound's gone or it all looks a bit vague or whatever. I think there are two things going on there that are not really going to apply in the solutions that you would want to deploy in social housing. So the first thing is that actually it's fairly cheap and cheerful Wi-Fi, first of all, when it's for a domestic setting. The second thing is that when people lose that connectivity, it isn't the Wi-Fi that is usually the problem. It is the internet provision that's usually the problem. And people get confused between, have we got Wi-Fi or have we got internet, right? So I think that's kind of the issues that tend to come from a domestic setting. What we're talking about here is something that is proper, professional, high-grade internet that is already used extensively in critical services. It will be used in the military, it'll be used in security services, it's used in government, it's used in the NHS, it's used in lots of circumstances where critical services are being delivered. You produce something that is absolute saturation coverage. and it is the Wi-Fi that's being provided. Internet is kind of like a separate thing completely. You don't need to worry about that in terms of the delivery of these services. It gives you the option, if you want to let residents have internet access. But in terms of the provision of critical services, it's high-grade, hospital-grade Wi-Fi. Now, what we do, just what we do in those circumstances, if we're deploying it from Alertacall, is that you survey the properties. You can run wireless access points down all the communal areas, down the corridors, in the communal rooms, and that kind of thing. You can test to make sure you've got saturation coverage in all parts of the property. So it can always be strengthened to make sure that you've got the right signal strength.
Indeed. And talk about when you're working with clients now in terms of both deploying the new technology, but also the challenge, I guess, around taking out the existing kit, to use the jargon. What's your experience of that process in terms of how you work with people on that kind of project perspective of A, taking out the old kit, and B, putting this new stuff in? What does that look like as a journey for people?
Yeah, so we tend to introduce our services on a staged approach, so that the last stage will then be decommissioning the existing equipment. So there's no gap. It's not that, oh, turn off what you've already got and we will install what we've got and there'll be a gap of a couple of weeks or whatever. We can install initially we would provide people with touchscreens, with door entry systems, and dependent alarms. At a second stage, you can then introduce the smoke detectors, and you do it stage by stage. And then at the very end of the process, then you would decommission what's already there. So you could put blanking plates in where there's been equipment on the wall, for example. The wiring, which under most circumstances will need upgrading, you tend to kind of like leave the wiring where it is, because quite frankly, it creates more disruption to try and remove it than it does to leave it where it is.
And where do you see, it's great that we focused in on a solution here to something that's obviously coming up in terms of whenever the deadline is, and just the general kind of obsolescence of an old-fashioned nature of the current solutions. But what do you see the future looking like in terms of, because to my mind, once you've got this kind of enhanced Wi-Fi driven, internet connected building, a facility, there must be some additional services that perhaps we don't know about yet that can be layered presumably quite easily on top of that once you've got that infrastructure there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I think it is one of the big benefits. Once you've got Wi-Fi in place, yes, it's the vehicle for us to be able to operate the door entry system, for example, or get out communications to people. But also that same internet, you can do a whole host of other things, some of which will be services provided today, some of which will be services we might not have even thought about yet, but can still kind of like piggyback on that Wi-Fi going forward. So, for example, it will be a cheaper CCTV solution if you are using Wi-Fi to host it. I mentioned before that you could provide internet access to residents if alleviating digital poverty is an issue for the landlord. There'll be all sorts of kind of like smart devices and Internet of Things devices that people want to put into people's homes, whether it be environmental sensors or all kinds of other sensors. They can all use that same equipment, that same Wi-Fi. I mean, from an interoperability perspective, it is incredibly versatile.
Mm-hmm. And I'm very mindful that of to use the kind of financial jargon in terms of asset types that developers and investors have been looking at in real estate. Clearly, this whole area of senior living is getting a lot of investment. A lot of new builds going on. What's the implications when people, are professionals involved with architects and quantity surveyors, when they're thinking about specifying new builds? What do they need to think about to have this kind of up-to-date approach to this kind of technology when they're specifying and designing and building in this literally from the ground up?
Yeah, so it's a good point. I think what we tend to see, whether it be either retrofit for existing buildings or whether it be new builds, there is sometimes a little bit of a tendency to kind of like, well, let's just dust off the spec that we've used previously, So, well, this is the way we've always done it. So, hey, it's as good a starting point as anywhere else, isn't it? And actually, I think that's where it's really worth, and I don't just mean this in the context of kind of like Alertacall services, it's where we're starting to see some housing providers go out with what you would call market engagement exercises. They're literally casting their net around to understand what is out there, right? What is better than we've got already? What's going to be more future-proofed than we typically see? And I think that's when you will come across the kind of innovations that probably aren't coming from the big incumbent suppliers who are always used to doing it the way they're always doing it. It is from other organisations that have come up with new innovative solutions. The sorts of thing I'm talking about is if people have seen devices on the walls at the moment, which might be the intercom system, it might be the door entry system where people talk to the wall. What they could really have is just something that's like this. So this is just, an 8-inch Android touchscreen.
Yeah.
It's on a stand, right? On a Perspex stand, it can actually be on a coffee table next to you, So actually, you think about a door entry system, and for older people, they can actually be triggers for falls. Because what happens is that a bit older, a bit more frail, they don't move as quickly as they used to. Somebody's at the door, maybe you get expecting a delivery, and you worry about whether you're going to get to that panel on the wall quickly enough, right? And that's what can trigger a fall. Why not have a device that sits on the coffee table where you can see the person, talk to the person, open the door to the person, and you haven't even got out of your chair? So it's kind of like wildly different. And that, by the way, that is one example that the residents themselves absolutely love. They absolutely love it. But I think when you're looking at kind of like new builds, I think Wi-Fi is a little bit of a magic bullet solution for that reason, but also think about the features associated with the peripherals that go along with that as well. Just a couple of examples, because we were talking about door entry. We have a door entry system whereby it continues to record a few seconds after somebody's entered the building. So from an ASB perspective, you can find out whether anybody's tagging or tailgating somebody coming into the building. The touch screen that I just showed you, it actually has a video audit trail of all of the callers, right? So you can actually go back and look at the video for somebody who came. But maybe somebody who didn't want to let into the building, that might have been an ASB issue as well. To be honest though, the thing that people like the most about it is that it also records the callers that you missed while you were out. When you're down the shops or away at friends or whatever. You can come back and you can see if you missed that delivery or you missed that friend or whatever it happened to be. So I think it's just looking at the art of the possible as much as anything else, and not just assuming the way it's always been done is still going to be the next way.
And do you think that there's almost a positive cultural drive here? Because it's always the cliche of silver surfers, and a generation of people, dare I say, coming into these senior living developments, and simply want a much more contemporary feel to the way these kind of services, if I can use that phrase, are actually delivered to them.
That is 100% the case, absolutely. So, when we deploy our services, we always do a resident satisfaction survey, kind of like 6 months after deployment, because we want to know we've got it right as much as anything else. And you get some people who say, well, if they've not been used to technology, they might not be happy with, something that looks a bit more modern. They might never have had a digital device, an iPad or whatever it happens to be. But I think, just showing this again, you can see that actually that's really not a very, very complicated interface. It's just the home page. It doesn't really go anywhere else beyond that. You just click on each of those buttons. The funny thing is, we used to deliver our services through a telephone, kind of like the traditional older person's telephone with the big buttons on there, and it also had a couple of extra buttons like an OK button, like we created. And when we were testing the touchscreen, we gave it to people who had been on the telephone version of our service for about 4 or 5 years. And this was 2 schemes of about 60 people. And after a few months, we went back and we did some focus groups, and we asked them whether they liked it and they didn't like it, and what could we improve and that kind of thing. But then we asked the ultimate question at the end, which was, so would you prefer to go back to the telephone that you've been using for a few years, which is a device of familiarity at the end of the day, or would you like to stay with the touchscreen? Not one single resident wanted to go back to the telephone. They were all very happy to use a touchscreen, and this was an average customer base of about 75.
So how about I suppose if we compare it to we've talked a lot about the benefits of this newer approach. From a kind of maintenance running cost perspective, are they pretty comparable in terms of what it's going to cost? Because I suppose people might think instinctively there's a lot more tech in this, therefore is there a higher operational expense as opposed to the capex when you're actually looking at maintaining these systems?
Yeah, interesting that, because you're right, there are two components of the pricing. So you've obviously got the capex expense, and then you got the the running costs thereafter. Just a word on the capex. Actually, although you get a lot more for your money, really, when you're talking about a Wi-Fi based solution, it's actually cheaper. It's usually considerably cheaper than actually implementing a hardwired solution. Why is that? Well, because there's hardly any hard wiring going on. There's just less installation work required if you're just putting, wires down corridors and Wi-Fi is getting into all the rooms. There's no installation on walls. So actually the capex is usually considerably cheaper. From a running cost perspective, there are various different components associated with it. So there's obviously the kind of like warranty maintenance requirements, replacement equipment should it fail. We've not had any yet, but obviously you need to make sure that that's covered. There are updates that you need to do for sort of security reasons, and we can do that all remotely, but those costs need to be covered. The service allows you to do things like report repairs, report antisocial behaviour, to get resident survey information, to disseminate messaging about housing updates or people changes or government regulations or reminders to pay your rent or whatever. So there's all of those costs as well. So all of that comes to about £4 or £5 a week. But the thing is, because it's housing management, it is housing benefit eligible and universal credit eligible, because it is there as an aid to help the landlord manage their properties. Yes, we provide as an add-on personal alarms, pendant alarms, and that bit isn't housing benefit eligible. But the great thing about that is that you only provide the personal alarms to those who want them, right? Now that might sound obvious, but actually when you think about it in the way that things are done today, you have to pay a monitoring charge if you are the landlord of a supported housing for every single flat or apartment, even if they don't want a personal alarm. Whereas with this solution, you just provide it on an as-needs basis for the people that want one, and you don't incur the cost for the people that don't.
So I mean, thinking ahead to this slightly moving deadline from BT in terms of the switchover, there's clearly going to be, dare I say it, some participants who perhaps attempted to leave it to the last minute. There's clearly going to be a fairly kind of large rush, I suppose, at some point to get these new systems implemented. I mean, do you see there being supply chain issues, resource issues about actually fulfilling this for this sector? Because I say there could be, unfortunately, a kind of a last minute rush to get this done before technically a lot of these systems are simply obsolete.
Yeah, I think there are two issues to do with supply chain, actually. And you have named one of them without doubt. So I think the first issue is that there are already kind of like some supply chain issues for traditional services and for various different components. And I think it's because they're relatively specialized components. They're not produced in vast numbers. Because our services revolve around a touchscreen, we literally use a supplier to ourselves for touchscreens. This is used to dealing in the tens of thousands each time it wants an order, right? So currently, we have no real supply chain issues as far as the touch being concerned, we can get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands if we needed to. And also the other services that sit alongside it, we're actually quite agnostic in terms of what they could be. So yes, we have a preferred supplier for door entry systems, but if they have a supply chain issue, we can use a different one. We've not had one to date. Yes, we've got a preferred supplier for personal alarms. Again, well, if they've got a supply chain issue, we can go to somebody else. So it's very interoperable. We're not dependent upon one particular route or one particular kind of like component of our proposition. So we don't have any supply chain issues as things stand today. However, the other supply chain issue is what you've mentioned, which is if you do the maths on the sheer number of schemes in the UK, and you think about how many need to be changed on a sort of an annual basis, even if it was put back until say 2027 or 2028, it's a huge number on an annual basis, right? And if people get on with it now, they will find there will be significantly less problem from a supply chain perspective. If they leave it 2 or 3 years, there will be supply chain problems without doubt, because there'll be lots of people leaving it later than they perhaps should do.
Indeed, indeed. Well, it's been a fascinating subject to chat through, Martin, and I'm particularly kind of heartened by, and I suppose it's a cliche to say this, but this sort of use of relatively simple digital technology to a cohort of people who I think perhaps it's fair to say have been kind of underserved in terms of using technology that's easy to use and really helps with their day-to-day living. And it's really heartening to have an application of technology that is so practical for a group of people who need support that is not delivered in an old-fashioned way, that is delivered in a contemporary way and really improves the experience for them and seems to add so many additional benefits as well as having the old-fashioned approach removed.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to leave you with some idea as to how much nicer it is as well, I think, in terms of the way the information is disseminated. So if people have kind of like messages to get across,
yeah,
there is a button here. What we're doing this backwards. I can let you do that. So it could be about smoke alarms.
Yeah.
It could be about a new housing officer. You could be sending a text message about something. That could be, in different languages, for example. If you've got tenants or residents whose English isn't their first language, it's actually quite easy to get information out. And I have to say, just harking back to when we were all in lockdown in COVID, you had people who were shielding, you had staff who were self-isolating, landlords were having to constantly change their rules because of lockdown rules. You can't have access to the communal areas, or we're only going to do emergency repairs, or whatever it happens to be, or just passing on what the latest government guidance was. Actually, that was really, really difficult to do by any other means if you didn't have that kind of like touchscreen facility whereby you could just distribute the information electronically very easily.
Indeed. Well, as I say, it's been fascinating and a really interesting lesson, I think, for a sector to think about how it implements technology and also keeps an eye on this deadline that, as you say, hopefully we'll get an update on soon. But for today, it's been great, Martin. Thanks ever so much. Look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you very much.